There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from never feeling finished. Not because the work itself is unfinished, but because you never feel satisfied. You know the thing. You tweak, you adjust, you edit, rework, delay. You tell yourself it just needs a little more time. But often what we call refinement is actually fear wearing sophisticated clothing. And for many creatives, perfectionism disguises itself as virtue, responsibility, high standards, excellence, even holiness. But today I want to challenge and to suggest something that may feel both uncomfortable and liberating. Perfectionism is not holiness. There it is. And also, in many ways, perfectionism is not even about perfection. It's about fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability, fear of being truly seen. And perhaps most deeply, fear of surrender. Because creativity asks us to release control, to make something without guarantees, to participate in uncertainty, to trust. And perfectionism struggles profoundly with trust. So today we're going to explore the difference between excellence and perfectionism, why perfectionism is often rooted in fear and control, how perfectionism slowly suffocates creativity, what the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi teaches us about beauty and imperfection, and why Scripture repeatedly shows us a God who works through imperfect people, imperfect processes, and imperfect offerings. Because the goal of the creative life isn't flawlessness. The goal of the creative life is faithfulness. Welcome to the Courage to Create podcast, a creative sanctuary for Christian artists and the wounded imagination. I'm Theodora Songhai, and I'm glad you're here. I think one of the reasons perfectionism is so difficult to recognize is because it often disguises itself as excellence. And excellence in itself is not a bad thing. Excellence says, I want to honor this work. I want to grow. I want to steward my gifts well. Excellence is rooted in care. Perfectionism, on the other hand, is rooted in anxiety. Excellence allows room for learning, while perfectionism punishes mistakes. Excellence says, this can improve. Perfectionism says, this must be flawless or it is worthless. Excellence invites movement, while perfectionism creates paralysis. And one of the clearest signs that perfectionism is operating is this. You stop creating, or you endlessly prepare to create without ever allowing yourself to begin. Perfectionism rarely appears out of nowhere. Usually it forms early. Like many of our creative wounds, sometimes through criticism. Sometimes perfectionism also forms through praise that was conditional. Sometimes through environments where achievement became linked to worthiness. You begin to internalize the idea that being loved equals being impressive, or mistakes make me unsafe. And eventually, perfectionism becomes a survival strategy, a way of trying to avoid shame, a way of trying to avoid rejection, avoid disappointment, But survival strategies that once protected us can later imprison us, especially creatively, because art cannot breathe under constant surveillance. I think this becomes especially important spiritually, because perfectionism is not simply a creative issue. It is often a relational and theological one. As Christian creatives, we worship a God who invites surrender, a God who collaborates, a God who walks with us. But perfectionism struggles deeply with surrender because surrender requires uncertainty. Perfectionism it demands guarantees. It wants certainty before obedience. It wants outcomes before vulnerability. Ultimately, it wants control. And this is why perfectionism can quietly distort our relationship with God. Because underneath perfectionism is often the belief that if I do everything perfectly, I can protect myself from pain. But relationship with God doesn't function through control. It functions through trust. Perfectionism says I must hold everything tightly. Faith says I can release this into God's hands. Perfectionism often imagines God primarily as evaluator, a God who is watching and assessing and scoring. But Scripture repeatedly reveals God as companion, as father, as shepherd, as co-laborer, the God who walks with humanity through process. And process is rarely tidy. Creativity requires experimentation, play. It also requires discovery, risk, and mistakes. But perfectionism makes mistakes morally loaded. A simple imperfect sketch suddenly becomes proof you are untalented. A failed idea becomes proof you should stop trying. Perfectionism creates impossible conditions for creativity. It says you may only begin when success is guaranteed. But creativity cannot survive under these conditions. Some of the most beautiful artistic discoveries happened accidentally. Unexpected brushstrokes, unplanned turn, brokenness transformed into beauty. Perfectionism leaves no room for any of these or for surprise, no room for mystery. Perfectionism leaves no room for becoming. And now this is why I love the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi. But wabi-sabi is difficult to translate fully. But at its heart, it is an appreciation of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. It finds beauty not in flawlessness, but in authenticity. So, for example, in weathered wood, in cracked ceramics, uneven textures, aging simplicity, things marked by time and use. One of the most best-known examples of wabi-sabi, and perhaps the most well-known, is kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. In this practice, the cracks are not hidden. They are illuminated, honored, integrated into the story of the object. And honestly, I think this reflects something profoundly spiritual. Because God does not discard wounded people. He restores. And often the places that were once broken become the places through which grace shines most visibly. Perfectionism says, hide the cracks. Grace says, even this can become beautiful. Scripture is filled with imperfect people. Moses stuttered. David failed morally and catastrophically. Elijah burnt out. Jonah ran away. Peter denied Jesus. Thomas doubted. Paul spoke openly about weakness. And yet God worked through all of them, not after they became flawless, through them as they were. And this somehow, I think, matters deeply, because perfectionism quietly assumes God can only use polished people. But the gospel tells another story entirely. God delights in working through weakness because weakness creates room for dependence. Paul writes of God, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Not perfection, rather dependence. And I hope this is deeply freeing creatively, because it means your work does not need to emerge from flawlessness to carry beauty, truth, or healing. I think the differences between holiness and perfection is important to clarify, because many people unconsciously confuse holiness with perfectionism. But holiness is not anxious flawlessness. Holiness means being set apart, consecrated, aligned towards God. It is relational before it is behavioral. Where perfectionism obsesses over appearance, holiness transforms from the inside out. Perfectionism is rigid where holiness is surrendered. Perfectionism is fear-driven, and where holiness is love-rooted. Jesus himself was holy, yet he was also deeply human. He was present. He was compassionate, flexible, interruptible. My goodness, was he interruptible? Perfectionism would never allow interruption, but love does. This reminds me of something Earl Nightingale once said. He said that the opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice, it is conformity. I think this is also profoundly true creatively, because perfectionism often pushes us towards conformity, towards safety, toward what is acceptable, toward what will avoid criticism. But courage requires differentiation. It requires risk. It requires truthfulness. And it requires some level of originality. And conformity can quietly suffocate the creative soul. Sometimes perfectionism is not actually about creating excellent work. Sometimes it is about creating work that will protect us socially. Work that will not offend, that will not stand out, that will not expose us. But creative courage asks something different. It asks, what is true? Not what is safest, what is true? So, how do we begin loosening perfectionism's grip? Well, you know what I'm going to say, right? Gently, not violently. Perfectionism itself often responds harshly. So we practice another way. Firstly, you can leave something imperfect. Intentionally stop before overworking. Allow the humanity of your work to remain visible. You can also create before judging. So one way of doing this is not to edit while generating, but rather let the creativity breathe first. You can finish small things. Perfectionism loves endless revision, but completion builds trust, especially trust in yourself and in your instincts. You can also practice play. So by creating something with no outcome attached. This is my favorite thing, especially when I do collage. I create collages with no outcome in my head. I just create for the pure joy of it. But for us and for recovering perfectionists, perhaps this also includes not posting or attempting to monetize, but just simply enjoying the joy of play. And then finally, remember you are not your work. Your worth is not hanging on the success of one project. You remain beloved even when something, quote unquote, fails. So, we have seen that perfectionism promises protection, but it often delivers imprisonment. It convinces us that if we can just become flawless enough, we can finally rest. But perfection never grants rest. Grace does. And perhaps true creative maturity is not becoming fearless or flawless, but becoming willing. Willing to begin imperfectly, willing to learn publicly, willing to fail publicly, willing to trust God within process, and willing to let our humanity remain visible. And so, dear friends, to you, the one exhausted by impossible standards, for the one trapped by endless revision, for the one who has confused perfection with worthiness, may you encounter the freedom of grace. May you discover that holiness is not flawlessness. It is surrender. May your creativity soften. May your striving loosen. May you create not from fear of failure, but from trust in the God who walks beside you. And may you remember that cracks do not disqualify you. Sometimes they are where the light enters. And so this week, I would like to invite you to complete something imperfectly. Not carelessly, not lazily, but honestly. Finish the sketch. Publish the poem. Share the photograph. Allow yourself to be human. And when perfectionism whispers, it isn't good enough, pause and ask, good enough for what? If this episode encouraged you, share it with another creative who may be struggling under the weight of perfectionism. And remember, you do not need to become flawless to begin creating courageously. If today's episode encouraged you, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps this sanctuary reach other artists who need it. And if you'd like guided creative exercises, devotionals, and spiritual tools for your artistic journey, visit the Creative Courage Sanctuary website and join the email community. Until next time, create bravely, rest deeply, and remember, your creativity is holy.